This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and today we're continuing with my Throne of Eldraine limited set review by looking at green. We've looked at the other 4 colors already, and tomorrow we'll be looking at the remaining cards. If you're new to my set reviews, in the description below you can see what my letter grades mean. Alright, let's look at our first green card, which is Beanstalk Giant. Beanstalk Giant is 6 generic mana and 1 green mana for a star uncommon giant, and his power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. He's also got an adventure, a new mechanic in this set where some creatures, in addition to being able to be cast normally, also have a sorcery or instant half to the card. And if you cast that half, the card is exiled, and then you can cast it as a creature later on in the game from exile. In this case, Beanstalk Giant has Fertile Footsteps, which for 2 generic and a green is a sorcery, and it lets you search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. I think this is nice. 3 mana Rampant Growth isn't amazing, but it is fixing that ramps you, and some decks will want that. And a 7 mana creature with the Beanstalk Giant's text box isn't awesome, but keep in mind that this is both of those things. You can get both of those things out of this card. You can use it early to fix and ramp, and then cast Beanstalk Giant as a big finisher later on in the game. I think green decks will want fixing and ramp often enough that they will want to run this, especially because he can also function as a win condition. Now, granted, he's kind of a mediocre win condition since he has no evasion to speak of, but he's a big boy, and sometimes that's what you need. This seems like a C to me. Next up, we have Curious Pair, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 human peasant at common. It has an adventure called Treats to Share, and for 1 green mana, you can create a food token. It's a sorcery. So, this doesn't seem like anything special to me. A 2 mana 1/3 is never that great. 1 green mana for a food isn't that good either. And 3 mana for a 1/3 and food, also not something special. I think you play this in a deck that really needs a 2-drop or really needs food, but you're not going to play it most of the time. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, we have Edgewall Innkeeper, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 human peasant at uncommon. And whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, you draw a card. And important reminder text on all of the adventure payoffs, or almost all of them, is that it says it doesn't need to have gone on the adventure first. It just has to have an adventure on the card. This means that you can just cast creatures who have an adventure without ever sending them on an adventure. And yeah, this card is all about adventuring, and it's a dang good payoff for it. I think it won't be all that difficult to get 4 to 5 cards with adventure in your typical green deck, and if you have that, you probably can play this, though it isn't going to be anything awesome in that case, but it's still probably a C. However, if you really get there on creatures who can adventure, this is going to be an insane value engine. You might be fragile as a 1/1, but I think even drawing 1 card off of this makes it worth it, and if you really get going, he's just going to win you the game. You probably need 7 or 8 cards with adventure, but if you get there, I think this is at least a B-, and because it has a reasonable floor and a nice ceiling, first picking this sometimes might make sense. Next up, we have Feasting Troll King, who for 2 generic and 4 green is a 7/6 Troll Noble at rare. He has Vigilance and Trample, and when he enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, create 3 food token, and he has an activated ability, sacrifice 3 foods, return Feasting Troll King from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate this ability only during your turn. That's a pretty challenging mana cost if you aren't mono green, but it is a pretty good payoff for that since it has incredible stats and doesn't stay dead. Monocolored, or at least closer to monocolored decks, look very possible in this format, so the Troll King may be easier to cast than I expect. I'm still a little skeptical though. I think you first pick this, but probably not over like the best uncommons in the set, premium removal and the like, just because it's so hard to cast. But it's still a card you're going to first pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Fell the Pheasant, who for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. And it says, Fell the Pheasant deals 5 damage to target creature with flying, create a food token. This is mostly a sideboard card, I think. There are flyers around, but some people are just going to have 0 to 2 targets for this, in which case it will be pretty bad. So I think it's a D in your main board and a C+ out of your sideboard. It's pretty efficient at killing flyers when you actually have targets for it. Next up, we have Fierce Witch Stalker, who for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 wolf at common. It's got Trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. A 4 mana 4/4 with Trample is already probably a C+. It's a great rate in Limited, and Trample creates some real problems for your opponent. Then, this makes food too, something that is heavily supported in this format, especially in black-green, and I think that does just enough to ensure that this gets into the lower B range at B-. I think first picking this in a weak pack is a reasonable thing to do, and I can't imagine ever wanting to cut the first 2 or 3 of these in any green deck. Next up, we have Flaxen Intruder, who for 1 green mana is a 1/2 human berserker at uncommon, and whenever Flaxen Intruder deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice it. When you do, destroy target artifact or enchantment. She also has an adventure, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a sorcery called Welcome Home, and she can create 3 2/2 green bear creature tokens. I'm not super impressed by this card, as both halves seem rather underwhelming. 7 mana for 3 2/2 bears isn't a great deal, and a 1/2 that can naturalize stuff when she hits the opponent isn't either. Now, it is cool that the adventure might allow you to do both of these things with the one card, but paying 8 mana for 3 2/2 bears and the 1/2 still doesn't feel that good to me. I don't really see myself wanting to play this in most situations, giving it a D+. Next up, we have Garen Brig Carver, who for 3 generic and a green is a 3/2 human warrior at common, and he has an adventure called Shield's Might, which is an instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So this is a mediocre combat trick on one side and a very mediocre creature on the other, but as I've been saying about a lot of the adventures this week, one card doing both things, mediocre or not, makes it so that these cards are better than they look. In an ideal world, you'll be using the trick half of this to win a combat, meaning you take down one of your opponent's cards, and then later on, you'll cast the creature half of this, who can then trade with something else, which does give you a 2-for-1. Now, tricks do come with a lot of inherent risks. You won't always have a board where they are useful, and your opponent might 2-for-1 you, but being able to cast the creature half helps make it so it isn't really a 2-for-1. Still, this isn't a great card by any stretch, and I think you'll cut it pretty frequently, but it is in the lower range of being a card that I feel alright about playing. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Garen Brig Paladin, which for 4 generic and a green is a 4/4 giant knight at common. It has Adamant, which is a mechanic in this set that gives you a bonus if you spend at least 3 mana of one of the color of the card on casting it. In this case, the Paladin enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if at least 3 green mana was spent to cast it. It also can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. A 5 mana 4/4 that can't be blocked by small dudes is kind of okay, probably a C-. The more green your deck is, though, the better this gets. A 5 mana 5/5 that can't be blocked by small creatures is way better, probably a C+. I'm going to split the difference between the version that isn't cast with Adamant and the one that is, and say this is a C. If you have 10 or more forests, it will frequently be closer to that C+, but if you're only playing 6 or 7 green sources, it's going to be closer to that C-. Next up, we have Garen Brig Squire, who for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human soldier at common, and whenever you cast a creature spell that has an adventure, Garen Brig Squire gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is not the most exciting adventure payoff around, but hey, it's a Grizzly Bears with upside that will allow it to attack as a 3/3 sometimes. These days, a vanilla Grizzly Bear is a C- at best and a D+ in most formats, but the upside here is very real. As I've said, most green decks will have at least 4 or 5 adventures without trying too hard. I mean, we've already seen a bunch of them, and that's plenty for him to be worth playing. In most formats, decks need a few 2-drops, and this one seems like a good option. I think it's a C. Next up, we have Giant Opportunity, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says you may sacrifice 2 foods. If you do, create a 7/7 green giant creature token, otherwise create 3 food tokens. I like this card. It's the kind of card that can really tie a food-centric deck together, since it can either be a payoff for having food tokens, or it can make you a bunch of food tokens reasonably efficiently for only 3 mana. 3 mana for a 7/7 is no joke, though keep in mind it will be difficult, though not impossible, to actually have enough food on turn 3 for this thing. Still, being able to do this on turn 5 seems reasonable, and that's pretty awesome. And yeah, really, 3 mana for 3 food isn't bad. I think I want this to be a build around because I just think you don't play it unless your deck has several ways of making food, which means it's an F. But it will be an important card in food-heavy decks that have, say, 7 or more ways of making food. It's going to be a nice payoff. I think it will be as high as a B- there. Next up, we have Gilded Goose, which for 1 green mana is a 0/2 bird at rare. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. and you can pay 1 generic and a green and tap it to create a food token. You can also tap it and sacrifice a food to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. You know I love this one. As you all know, I love birds, especially waterfowl, so I'm pretty excited about this card on a Vorthosy level. That said, it is also a pretty good card. It's probably one of the best sources of fixing in this entire format, and the fact that you can use food for life too if you're desperate doesn't hurt, and the fact that it's a repeatable source of food for all your food payoffs doesn't hurt. It's even in a good place to stick equipment on it since it has evasion. I don't think you want to first pick this most of the time, but I think taking this relatively early is a good call since it will make splashing or playing 3 colors so much easier. I'm giving this a C+, and there's a real potential, I think, that I'm underrating how good it's going to be to have a repeatable source of food because there aren't that many of them, and maybe it moves up to a B- in a world where that's more powerful than I'm expecting. Next up, we have the Great Hinge, which for 7 generic mana and 2 green is a Mythic Rare legendary artifact. It costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. You can tap it to add 2 green mana and gain 2 life, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. I think I like this a lot. Obviously, you're going to need some beefy creatures to really take advantage, but even a 4-power creature reduces this to 5 mana, and that's a great price for something like this. I would also be very happy paying 6. Putting a +1/+1 counter on all your non-token creatures and drawing a card in the process is what really makes this a bomb for me. It doesn't hurt that it can also produce mana and gain you life. After all, if you're drawing cards, you might have use for all that extra mana, and gaining 2 life a turn off of this will be a nice way to pay you back for probably taking off an entire turn just to play this. I think that this is the best of this Mythic Rare cycle of legendary artifacts in Limited. It's a bomb. I'm always going to first pick it, and it will also really pull me into its colors if I see it. I'm giving it an A. Next up, we have Insatiable Appetite, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says you may sacrifice a food. If you do, target creature gets +5/+5 until end of turn. Otherwise, that creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. This is a nice trick. 2 mana for +3/+3 is already a reasonable one that you play one of in a lot of aggressive green decks, and the additional food upside here is pretty legit. 2 mana for +5/+5 is some serious business. It's still a trick, and if you know me, you know I rarely give these something above a C because of how situational and risky they can be, but this gets a C, which is pretty nice for a trick. Next up, we have Keeper of Fables, who for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/5 cat and uncommon, and it says whenever 1 or more non-human creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. This is really good, probably one of the best uncommons in the entire set. 5 mana 4/5s are good and limited, and the fact that this draws you extra cards is great. Even if you have 0 other non-humans in your deck, which isn't going to happen, but even if it did, this would be a great card since it is a non-human and will draw you a card when it hits the opponent. Now, make sure you're aware that you are only going to be drawing a maximum of 1 card per combat because of the way it is worded, but that's fine. The Keeper can single-handedly take over games thanks to the cards it draws you, and that makes it an easy first pick in my book. I'm giving it a B, and it might even be a B+. Next up, we have Kenrith's Transformation, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a green elk creature with base power and toughness 3/3. This is an interesting one. Making something into a vanilla 3/3 can have multiple uses. You can shut down super powerful creatures they have, or you can make one of yours bigger. Normally an effect like that isn't awesome though, because it really isn't that great at either of those things. Making your 1/1 into a 3/3 won't have a huge impact most of the time, and sure, turning your opponent's scary dragon into a 3/3 is going to be a relief, but you're still letting your opponent have a decent sized creature that can block and attack. Without the cantrip effect, I feel like this would probably be a D. However, because this also draws you a card, it means that you're always going to be getting more than a full card of value out of this. Not a whole lot more than 1 card of value, mind you, but still more. I think you'll play the first one of these in most of your green decks, but I'm not overjoyed by it at all. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Lovestruck Beast, who for 2 generic and a green is a 5/5 Beast Noble at rare, and he can attack unless you control a 1/1 creature, and he has an adventure called Heart's Desire. For 1 green mana, he can make a 1/1 white human creature token, and it's a sorcery. Obviously, a 3 mana 5/5 is incredible. If we just take away the adventure part of the card and assume this is a 3 mana 5/5 with Defender, that would still be pretty nice in a lot of decks, since that is a pretty frightening blocker. the fact that he can attack if you have a 1/1 in play is some nice value, because you can send him on an adventure on turn 1 or so and then actually cast him on turn 3 and he'll be ready to go. Here, your total investment is pretty nice, since it is 4 mana for a 5/5 and a 1/1. Now, there are definitely going to be times where you just can't keep a 1/1 in play and he won't be attacking, but like I said, the fail case of a 3 mana 5/5 with Defender is a fine place to be. Overall, I like what I see here, and I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Mah Relief Rider, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 Elf Knight at common, and you can sacrifice a food and target creature blocks Mah Relief Rider this turn if able. A 2 mana 3/1 is usually pretty close to a C- or a C, and this comes with some decent upside. It isn't the most exciting food payoff, but being able to make your opponent's X3 have to block this when you know you're going to trade up doesn't hurt. I'm giving this a C. It's a solid 2-drop. Next up, we have Occam Adversary, who for 3 generic and a green is a 2/3 Elf Warrior at uncommon. It costs 2 less to cast if your opponent controls a green permanent. This is the green card in the cycle of uncommons that hate on their own color. It's got Death Touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. This is pretty nice. Even if we take the line away about your opponents having green permanents, this would be a solid playable. A 4 mana 2/3 with Death Touch that can draw you a card when it hits your opponent is going to be good enough to make the cut in most green decks. Those two effects combined is always pretty potent because your opponent is put in a difficult situation, especially if the only blockers they have are large or if you're backing this up with combat tricks. And, Death Touch means it can trade with anything blocking as well. I think on its own, this would probably be a C- or a C, but with the additional text, where it can be 2 mana to cast, I think you're getting enough upside often enough from that line of text that I think this is a C+. Enough people will be playing green that casting it for 2 is just going to happen at least once most of the time you draft one of these. Next up, we have Once in Future, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. It says return target card from your graveyard to your hand, put up to 1 other target card from your library on top of your library, exile Once in Future. And it has Adamant. In this case, if you spend at least 3 green mana to cast it, you instead return those cards to your hand and exile Once in Future. So 4 to return a card to your hand and improve your card selection isn't completely terrible, but it's not amazing either. It's a little bit clunky for that effect. Normally, for 4 mana, we're kind of hoping we get to put 2 cards into our hand with this sort of effect. And this can do that, but you have to get the Adamant going on it for it to be there. I think this will feel a lot like black effects that let you return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, even if this is a little more flexible. You're just not always going to be able to get 2 things in your graveyard worth getting, especially in the early game. Still, I think I probably want one of these in most of my green decks, especially those with 10 or more forests, but more than one of them might be asking for trouble since they are considerably conditional. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Once Upon a Time, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare instant. It says if this spell is the first spell you've cast this game, you may cast it without paying its mana cost. Then you look at the top 5 cards of your library, you may reveal a creature or land card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So we see this kind of effect a lot, and it is always decent. I think it's fair to compare this to Anticipate. It lets you see more cards, but is less flexible about what you grab. But whiffing with this will be almost impossible since most limited decks are 32 or more lands and creatures combined. The fact that it is free if you get it early is some nice upside, but in limited, where you're going to have 1 copy, I don't know how often that's going to work out for you. In the end, I'm just giving this what I would give Anticipate, a C-. It is easy to cut since it isn't the most impactful card ever, but you could do a lot worse. Next up, we have Outmuscle, which for 3 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then it fights target creature you don't control. It's got Adamant. In this case, if you spend at least 3 green mana to cast it, the creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. This is a strictly better Hunt the Weak, and that is not a bad place to be. Hunt the Weak is always a solid removal spell, but not premium. It isn't premium because of how clunky it is at 4 mana and sorcery speed, and because fight effects are removal spells that are really easy to interact with, since killing the creature in response to the removal spell or pumping their creature in response to it results in a pretty savage blowout. However, if you can trigger Adamant on this, is that a premium removal spell? It's definitely closer, because being able to fight and kill something and then attack with an enlarged indestructible creature is going to be a nasty sequence. That's probably a B-, maybe even a B. But because of how Adamant works, this won't always be premium, but if you have around 10 forests in your deck, I think it will pretty frequently reach a pretty high level of power. I still think that this is held to a C+. It's still a 4-mana fight spell that your opponent can blow you out on, but in a deck that can really get there on green mana, it's going to be better than that. Next up, we have Questing Beast, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 legendary beast at Mythic Rare. It has Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, and whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. So, a 4-mana 4/4 with Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste is amazing on the vanilla test alone. This also can't be blocked by small creatures, which is nice. However, the other parts of this card won't come up that often in Limited. There aren't many ways to prevent damage, and there aren't many planeswalkers in this format, so that text doesn't mean much here. There will be common creatures in the format that can just block and trade with it, or worse, just straight up win combat, but even then, this will trade with anything. It can attack and hang back and block, and it can attack right away, and that's a pretty powerful combination. I do think it falls just below bomb range. Lacking any form of evasion, I think, is what holds it back from that. And this is the kind of card that's probably going to be really, really great in Constructed, and it's only going to be super good in Limited. I think it's just a B+ instead of an A. Obviously, that still means you're first picking it basically every time you see it, but I do think it falls short of being a bomb. Next up, we have Return of the Wildspeaker, which for 4 generic and a green is a rare instant. It says choose one. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. So, Return of the Wildspeaker has 2 pretty attractive options, and it seems pretty likely that one of them will be useful to you most of the time when you're in green. There are lots of non-humans in this format, so drawing cards with this won't be all that hard most of the time, and being able to give +3/+3 to non-humans at instant speed can be utterly backbreaking. All that said, I think we still need to give this a build-around grade. While I think most green decks will probably have 5 or 6 non-humans, that's probably only enough for this to be like a D+. You have to go deeper on non-humans to get the full benefit of this card, probably something like 8 or more, in which case it's probably a B-. Next up, we have Return to Nature, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says choose one. Destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from a graveyard. We saw this pretty recently, and I think it's going to be even better here because this format has a ton of artifacts and enchantments. The ability to exile a card from a graveyard might also come up from time to time. But I think it's good enough and flexible enough that you can mainboard this and have it be like a C-. It's probably still a little more ideal out of your sideboard where it's a C+. Next up, we have Rose Thorn Acolyte, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 elf druid at common, and it can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Seasonal Ritual is an adventure, and you can pay 1 green mana to add 1 mana of any color. So, the Acolyte's adventure is one of the most underwhelming ones around, essentially just letting you filter mana. But hey, sometimes that does matter. Most of the time though, you're going to get value out of it being a creature, as a 3 mana 2/3 that fixes and ramps for you is a pretty nice thing to have around. I think it's a C+. Next up, we have Rose Thorn Halberd, which for 1 green mana is an artifact equipment at common. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target non-human creature you control, and the equipped creature gets +2/+1. It has an equip cost of 5. I think this seems decent. 1 mana for +2/+1 permanent stats boost, provided you have a non-human in play, is a nice rate. But your deck has to have enough non-humans around for this to be worth it, because after that first creature, the equip cost is super steep. I think that keeps this from being anything more than slightly below average filler that you'll cut most of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, we have Spore Cap Spider, who for 2 generic and a green is a 1/5 spider with reach at common. Those are some nice defensive stats. We've seen a lot of 3 mana 1/4 reach spiders over the years, and obviously, this is strictly better. Aggressive green decks won't really want this, but all the other green decks should feel fine about playing the first of these. This stonewalls the vast majority of creatures in the format, including flyers. I think it's a C-. Next up, we have Sir Farron the Hengehammer, who for 2 green mana is a 2/2 human knight, a legendary one at uncommon, and when it attacks, another target attacking creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Sir Farron's power. The cheapest of all the cards in the Sir cycle, Sir Farron seems pretty nice. A 2 mana 2/2 that pumps another attacker is great, and is probably even more potent if you have ways of pumping it. I don't think this is quite good enough to first pick, just because he really needs some help to attack and survive combat. There will be times where even without help, he can make your attack profitable, but he won't be amazing or anything. I think he's a C+. You'll never cut him in a green deck, but it isn't something you want to pick one, I don't think. Next up, we have Tall as a Beanstalk, which for 3 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura. It's got Enchant Creature, and Enchanted Creature gets +3/+3, has Reach, and is a giant in addition to its other types. I don't think I will ever play this card. Lately, they've been printing auras that are actually playable because of their efficiency or their ability to mitigate against the dreaded 2-for-1, but this isn't either of those. 4 mana for +3/+3 and Reach really isn't the most amazing deal in the world, and it leaves you wide open to 2-for-1s that will also get huge tempo on you because of the total mana you spend on the creature and this aura. The only time you might want to play this is if you have several creatures who are particularly good with auras, like those with hexproof, but there's not really any of that in this set. I'm just going to start this at an F. Next, we have Trail of Crumbs, which is 1 generic and a green for an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. Whenever you sacrifice a food, you may pay 1 generic mana. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library. You may reveal a permanent card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This seems like a pretty sweet food build-around. In super grindy games, this drawing you extra cards is going to be some pretty serious value, especially because it even gives you some selection over what you draw. It will be hard to whiff on 2 cards in limited. Most of what's in your deck are going to be permanents, but the fact they can't draw you most removal is kind of annoying. You can use this just sacrificing food normally, at which point you are paying 3 to gain 3 life and draw a card, which is amazing. But I think this will be the most impressive index that can sacrifice food to other permanents without any mana cost, because it will be a lot easier to just pay 1 mana to draw the card here. I think this card definitely needs a build-around grade because of that fact. Any old card that makes food will work with it, but it won't be at their best with all of them. There is enough food in this format that I think this is playable in your main board on average, but probably a pretty easy cut most of the time, probably a C-. But I think it gets all the way up to a B in a deck that really gets there on food. If this format ends up being really fast, this might not be quite as good, but food and adventure are both pretty grindy mechanics, so I don't imagine that being the case. Next, we have 2 Unveil Treefolk, who for 5 generic and a green is a 6/5 Treefolk Druid at common, and he's got an adventure called Oaken Boon, which is a sorcery that costs 3 generic and a green, that lets you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. Like a lot of these adventure cards at common, if we look at each part of the card and imagine it as just that, neither half here is all that great. 4 mana for 2 +1/+1 counters at sorcery speed would probably be unplayable, and a 6 mana 6/5 is probably a C- at best. But like all of these, it has the potential to do both of those things, and that's not a bad way to be spending your mana. Getting a full 2 cards worth of value out of this single card is very doable, and I think this will be a nice big boy to have at the top of your curve too, since it can make your guys bigger earlier on in the game. It's a solid playable. I think you'll play 1 in most green decks and feel fine about it, giving it a C. Next, we have Wicked Wolf, who for 2 generic and 2 green is a 3/3 wolf at rare. When it enters the battlefield, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control, and you can sacrifice a food to put a +1/+1 counter on Wicked Wolf. It gains indestructible until end of turn, and you tap it. So how good is a 4 mana 3/3 that fights something when it comes down? Pretty darn good. That would probably be a B-. Sure, it can only kill and survive fighting with creatures who have 3 or less power and 2 or less toughness, but that still means it kills a significant portion of creatures in the format, and then gets to stay around, usually netting you a 2-for-1. On top of that, he likes to eat food, and if you have even 1 food in play when you play him, he gets considerably more frightening, since he not only increases in size, he gains indestructible. Most decks are going to have food in them in this format without even trying, especially green ones, so I think he is pretty great. Obviously, he gets crazier the more food you have. He can become indestructible whenever he needs to in a deck with a lot of food. That means he can block and become indestructible, attack and you can threaten indestructible. He can just do a lot of different things. He can, when he comes down to fight, you can make him indestructible and bigger if you need to. And all of that's pretty great, but I do think it falls short of being a bomb just because it does ask for a little bit of help. But if you have a ton of food, maybe it is a straight up bomb, but for now I'm keeping it at B+. Next up, we have Wildborn Preserver, who for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf archer at rare with flash and reach, and whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay X. When you do, put X +1/+1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. A 2 mana 2/2 with flash is already a decent card, probably at least a C, but this also has reach and can get bigger, so it is far, far better than that. I honestly think the Preserver is a rare example of a 2-mana bomb. The fact you can just use all your excess mana when you play a non-human creature to make this a lot larger is awesome, and it can rapidly get out of hand. Obviously, you need to get those non-human creatures, but even with just like 4 or 5 of those, which should be easy to make happen, you're going to love playing this. I just love that it gives you stuff to do with your mana all game long, especially because what it does is so impactful. I think this is an A-, which means you'll always be first picking it. Next up, we have Wildwood Tractor, who for 1 green mana is a 1/1 elf warrior at common, and when it attacks or blocks, if you control another non-human creature, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So, as we've seen, this format has a lot of non-human creature synergies, especially in red, green, and blue. But I'm not that excited by this one. In the later parts of the game, it just won't matter much when it becomes a 2/2. Will it be sweet to play on turn 1, then a non-human on turn 2? Sure, but there are some serious diminishing returns as the game goes. I do like that it also gets pumped when it blocks. Lots of versions of this type of effect don't. Still, I think it's just a D+. Next up, we have Wolf's Quarry, who for 4 generic and 2 green is a common sorcery, and it creates 3 1/1 green board creature tokens with, whenever this creature dies, create a food token. I don't like this very much. 6 mana for 3 1/1s is a bad rate, even if they do give you food when they die. And sure, there aren't a ton of cards in this set capable of producing multiple food, and this can do it, but man, it does it at a very steep cost, especially because then your food costs mana to gain life with it. If you have enough ways to really take advantage of food, this will sometimes work out, but I can really see it not going so well more often than not because you were just spending so much mana for not the most impressive payoff. I think this is something you'll play sometimes in a very food-heavy deck, but most of the time, I think you'd like to avoid it. I'm giving it a D+. And our last green card is Yorvo, Lord of Garen Brig, who costs 3 green mana. He's a rare, legendary giant noble who's a 0/0. Yorvo, Lord of Garen Brig, enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever another green creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. Then, if that creature's power is greater than Yorvo's power, put another +1/+1 counter on Yorvo. Like most of this cycle of triple-costed legendaries, the payoff here is real enough that I think you can first pick this despite the commitment it asks of you. The upside is just too high not to. A 3-mana 4/4 is already nice, but one that constantly gets bigger if you play green creatures is even better. He will be capable of just taking the game over thanks to his sheer size and efficiency. I do think you want to take some of the best monocolored commons and uncommons in this set over him because of how much he asks of you, but there will be times when first picking him is the right thing to do, giving him a B-. So, those are all the green decks in Throne of Eldraine. We only have one last video for the full set review to be complete, and it will come out tomorrow, the video on multicolored cards, colorless cards, and lands. After that, I'll also be doing an archetype guide and another video or two about this format. And of course, very soon, draft videos for this format will also be up. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen right about now. Thanks for watching.